The second major method of cultivating compassion, and by the way, both of these methods can be done before one has achieved the deepest level of genius wisdom, where one has floated into space and then come back into the dreamlike nature of things after having seen them all dissolve into infinite space, and oneself dissolve into infinite space, past the boundary of nothingness, experientially speaking. So one can do these cultivations of compassion before reaching those things, because they develop the pattern within oneself in an effective way. Of course, it's much more powerful afterwards, because it becomes almost automatic afterwards. But it's good to do them before. It's considered important and excellent to do them before, even though they know that you cannot achieve the full level of compassion through either method until you have developed the genius wisdom. But nevertheless, they go ahead and do it. So the second one is called the equal exchange of self and other. And it is, the instruction is what it is called, and it is given in the work of Nagarjuna, his famous jewel rosary. But its textual tradition eventually culminates in a famous work by the great Shantideva in the late 7th, early 8th century, which is called Volunteering for the Bodhisattva Way of Life. Chapter 8, verses 90 through 170, if you want to know the precise locus of it. And you will get this in the homework for this section. The Dalai Lama used to tell me when he was younger and less sentimental than he is nowadays, that he had difficulty thinking of an enemy or just an unpleasant person as his mother. And so he preferred this instruction, the exchange of self and other. It is paired up in the text with chapter 6, wherein Shantideva gives a most extraordinary treatment of developing patience, the antidote of anger and hatred. Before one can feel a genuine love and compassion for other beings, one must develop a tolerance of their tendency to injure and irritate and annoy you. Anger is transformed by the first type of patience, the tolerant patience. That's the no pain, no gain one, combined with wisdom. And finally, it is conquered by the patience of forgiveness. Basically, it is not possible to develop universal compassion except on the basis of having already overcome the addictive emotion of anger, by developing the patient tolerance that cannot be overcome by any kind of irritation, anger, injury, or hatred. This is not achieved just by thinking one should do it in a moralistic way. It requires that genius wisdom that understands how mind and emotions work and recognizes that hate and anger always harm the hater even more than the hated target, which is definitely true. I can vouch for that myself. Having basically a bad temper, it's always more harmful to the angry person than the other one. If it sometimes is harmful to the other one, it usually draws back even greater harm from the other one or the other one's relatives, sooner or later. There's always blowback. So moving beyond patience to cultivate the universal compassion of the Bodhisattva spirit, the exchange of self and other practice seems simple on the surface. One takes note of the fact that one constantly thinks in one's inner thought monologue, quote, what will make me happy? What do I want to get? What do I want to be? What do I want to do? What do I want to have? Well, I feel I have every right to get, be, do, and have just that. One then realizes that's what one constantly thinks about and broods about, how one should be happy and one deserves to be, and it's right that one should be, and so forth. One then reflects on another being, or others one by one, that host of beings that you surround yourself in the meditative field, in your imagination. And you realize that from their point of view, they also feel the same way. They're all sitting around you thinking, well, I want to be happy. Well, what am I getting out of this? And what is this? What's in this for me? And so on. They're all thinking that. So one carries this forward, interpolating from one's own strong feelings of self-concern and realizing how others have them, and then realizing how many more others are sitting there having them. And then one begins to empathize with others' such feelings of their own self-concern. One then recognizes that every single other being feels that way. It then becomes graphically apparent to oneself that there are so many more others than just oneself. and their desires sort of aggregate in your contemplation into a so much greater force than one's own desires, it begins to seem logical that one should pay attention to that huge force of others' desires. It's like, sometimes when one sees someone, one is a lifeguard or something, thinking about, well, what am I going to do today when my lifeguarding is over? What am I going to eat for dinner? Who am I going to see? My girlfriend, my boyfriend, whatever, etc., etc. And then suddenly one sees someone shouting, help, help, help. There's a force of that need that one drops thinking about oneself and rushes toward them. And imagine in meditation, you suddenly feel the help, help, help from so many beings. The force of others' desires is like standing before a huge cataract, a roaring falls. The trickle under one's own feet of what I want becomes insignificant, and one temporarily forgets about it. One then also begins to notice that one never does enjoy much of whatever one does get, or is, or does, or has, since one always wants more. The unsatisfied wanting spoils all the getting, etc. Analyzing one's own aesthetic experiences with such contemplative concentration, one realizes that satisfaction always only comes from forgetting about what more one wants. Next, one realizes easily that one way of doing so is to focus on what others want. So in other words, you sort of jump straight to the lifeguard thing who stops worrying about how great their date is going to be in whichever restaurant or person or whatever it is, when they forget about what they want, and then they rush to save the person whose their job is, who's drowning. And so then one realizes easily that one way of doing that is just to focus on what other people want. As the Dalai Lama likes to say, when you practice the exchange of self and other and become compassionately focused toward others, the first person whom you do make happier, who you lessen their suffering of, is your own very self. So if you want to be happy, be compassionate. To succeed in being selfish successfully, be wisely selfish and be compassionate. In other words, you have to work through Shantideva's formulation of this process in his brilliant text to get the simplicity, complexity, and power of this insight. It is said that he was a kind of dropout student monk of Nalanda, and the teachers and fellow students, this is now about Shantideva, considered him hopeless. His nickname was Busuku, he who only eats, sleeps, and defecates. So they finally insisted that he graduate, because they got tired of it. They wanted to kick him out, in other words, which involved giving all the thousands of monks a learned lecture. That was their graduation ceremony. When he agreed to show up and do that, he had a huge audience, because they all thought it would be such a farce, because he had been such a big dropout and probably didn't know anything. So how could he possibly give any kind of decent, thesis or lecture, oral lecture to them? So he shocked them all at that time by reciting the 800 verses of the Bodhisattva career, or the volunteering for the Bodhisattva lifestyle. And he then proceeded, in the myth of the story, to levitate from his podium and float away to the eastern province of Odisha. He then they were chasing him. In fact, scribes were writing down this brilliant, exquisite poetry. Although he actually left a written copy, he also said to them, when they were worrying about it, under his bed in the room where he had been working all night, which is why he was sleeping in classes in the daytime. He then adopted the name Shantideva, which means God of Peace, so that anyone who heard his name would feel peaceful, Shanti, just from hearing it. He resigned from the monk's profession as well, returned to being a layman because he wanted to become a tantric adept, actually, and continued for many years to live and teach as a great adept, a Mahasiddha, a tantric practitioner of the most advanced esoteric yogas of the universal vehicle, in the tantric or Vajra diamond thunderbolt vehicle. The fascinating thing about Shantideva's great book on volunteering to be a bodhisattva is how the debates within his own mind, the way he pits his narrow selfish mind against his wise and altruistic mind. He thus shows us the power of the logic of relativity and how it leads to wisdom and unleashes the power of compassion.